Hello and welcome to this episode of Monkey Bread Theology. My name's Tim. I am the asker of your questions. And in the hot seat we have
Jovan Paez, a.k.a. the demon-stomping evangelist.
There you go. So, Jovan, we've got a question for you.
All right.
You for this?
I'll try to be.
Okay. So, I'm looking to buy a Bible.
All right.
And I'm wondering, what is a good translation to get? What should I stay away from?
Yeah, that is a great question. And, you know, that's the kind of question that a lot of us end up at some point going, I want a Bible, and do I continue with the Bible that I grew up on?
Mm-hmm.
Do I start with a new Bible altogether? And then that part is a really terrifying question, because now in the English language, the question isn't, can I find a Bible? The question is, what Bible?
Right.
You know, so that's a really great question. And a couple things that kind of play into this question is, what exactly are we doing when we're trying to buy a Bible? And so I want to kind of break down this question to a little bit of background about why we have so many Bibles, and then what is the Bible itself in a short kind of roundabout way, and then answer the question more directly. So the first thing I want to say is, what exactly is the Bible itself?
Mm-hmm.
So the Bible that we bring to church, the preacher preaches from, you know, those sorts of elements. You know, we tend to think, pop culture tends to think that the Bible is a European book, is a book of a English-speaking kind of, dare I say, white man's religion kind of thing.
Okay.
Right? But the problem with that view is it's completely wrong. It's completely off base. Yes, because the Bible itself is a translation of ancient documents from what we might call today the Middle East.
Okay.
And so the ancient Near East, which is like Jerusalem, Egypt, those areas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they don't speak English. In the first century, let's say first century AD, they're not speaking English.
Okay.
And certainly not speaking English in the 5th century or 8th century BC. They're speaking languages like Hebrew. They're speaking languages like Greek. They're speaking languages like Aramaic. They're speaking, you know, languages like Persian and so forth and so on, right? So the Bible we use in the English-speaking world is an ancient book
mm-hmm.
from a set of ancient cultures using predominantly 3 languages that are ancient and not English.
Okay.
So I'm going to great pains to set that stage because, again, pop culture has it wrong here.
Right.
The Bible is not a European white man's book. It is, if anything, born out of a ethnic background, we might say today, right? Semitic background. So the Jews, for example, are Hebrew, and they are what we've called the Semitic culture, and it goes back to cultures for them. You know, you're looking at the second millennium, in the first millennium BC, the first 2,000 years. And they wrote these books down, what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, in predominantly Hebrew,
mm-hmm.
sometimes called classical Hebrew, but it just depends who you talk to. And then there are sections, like in the book of Daniel and then book of Ezra. And in Daniel, for the most part, you have the Hebrew intro in terms of the language it's written in, and the Hebrew outro, but the bulk of the whole book is in Aramaic, which is really interesting. And the book of Ezra has, I think, chapter 4, 5, all the way to 7 in Aramaic. So those 2 books have the most interesting kind of hybrid
Yeah.
kind of thing going on there with Hebrew and Aramaic. It was so interesting in reading about that, because one fascinating fact before I move on is there was a time when scholars thought that the book of Daniel, it was corrupted, or it had a strange sort of development in how it was written, right? So because he went from Hebrew, Aramaic, and back to Hebrew. And so there's a lot of speculation about all of that. And they said, no, this is probably a corruption. And so people just kind of slapped together a Hebrew version and an Aramaic translation of some kind. And so they just can't be this way. It can't be the way it is. What was interesting is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they found it in around 1947 and publications started coming out about what they found in there, guess what they found in the sections, the transition parts in Daniel from Hebrew to Aramaic and Aramaic to Hebrew? They were there.
Oh, they were.
They were there. So, and these manuscripts likely push our knowledge of the Hebrew text of those books, especially Daniel, to about the 2nd or 3rd century BC.
Okay.
So my point is, this is just a really fun fact. A little bit of trivia here, but my point is, when we look at these books in the Old Testament, we're dealing with an ancient language from an ancient culture, Hebrew and Aramaic. When you read the New Testament, you have the book entirely written in Greek.
Okay.
In Greek language, and the reason for that is pretty much everyone in the first century spoke Greek.
Mm-hmm.
It was not the classical Greek of celebrated philosophers of Athens and all that. Attic Greek and all these other, Ionic and Doric and all these other kinds of Greek. But around 350 BC and pushing all the way to 350 AD, I always found those numbers interesting. There was this dominant progressive development in Greek language. We call it Koine Greek, which is a word that means common, sort of the everyman Greek.
Okay.
And part of the story behind that is when Alexander the Great began the conquest that he would be famous for, he would become famous for, using his deceased father's battle plans. Alexander, true to his family, adored Greek culture. They were Macedonians, which is a group of people just north of traditional Greece.
Okay.
And Philip of Macedon, Alexander's father, he tried to kind of negotiate himself into the Greek world and try to gain their trust and favor. In an interesting play of strategy, Alexander himself would be held captive behind enemy lines in Athens, and he would live in Greece for a time as a young man until Philip could kind of get him back out. And so it's this kind of crazy world. And in the process, Alexander became infatuated with Greek culture. His tutor was Aristotle. He is very much Greek-minded. And when he goes off to battle and carry out this battle plan to push the Persians back and kind of gain this relationship with the Greek world, he has another kind of wrinkle to his mission. Mm-hmm. Every major culture in every city he conquers, he then will sort of remake in the Greek mind.
Okay.
After the Greek image.
Greekify.
So he will Greekify them, right? He'll Hellenize them, which is, more, I guess, the official way of saying it. And he evangelized them with Greek culture. So he's basically imposed Greek culture, Greek language. Mm-hmm. Cities would be rebuilt in the sort of format of a Greek city-state. And so he starts building, as he does this, cities are being rebuilt, cultures being redeveloped, right. and along the lines, as he, all the way, as my history teacher said, after Alexander conquered the world, he got a cold and fell off his horse and drowned. That's not how he actually died. There's a lot of mystery to how he died, but the point is, by the time he's a young man, he's in his 20s and he dies.
Mm.
And the legacy behind is massive, not just for reshaping the political landscape, but introducing Greek culture to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens here is trickles down to the New Testament time, because you now have basically people who are speaking a impure Greek.
Okay.
It's a diluted Greek. It's a Greek with far more slang developed by non-native Greek speakers. It's Greek as a second language.
Yeah.
And that means a lot of corners are cut, a lot of colloquial kind of things happen, and it's regional. So it's a really fascinating story. And again, I say all that because what is it that we have in the New Testament? This Greek language. There was a time in the 1800s and the late 19th century that the Greek was so weird and so unique that Greek scholars had all kinds of theories as to what kind of Greek this is, that they even said this is so different from classical Greek and or Attic and Ionic and Doric Greek and all these other kind of Greeks, regional classical Greek centers. They said it must be a Holy Spirit kind of Greek.
Mm.
So really fascinating. Around the last, let's say, quarter of the 19th century, massive like papers and papyrus were found in Greek language in Egypt, and they began to study these and realize, wait a minute, these are like marriage certificates. These are like grocery receipts. These are like shipping yard receipts.
Mm-hmm.
These are documents of the everyday person. These are letters, just personal letters. There are letters of people writing home saying, "Hey, honey, I'm going to be gone for another few months because I'm working. But if you have a child and it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, expose it." Like all these. Like it starts off tender, but it ends up really being horrible, right?
Yeah.
But what they learned was this Greek is exactly the same Greek of the New Testament.
Oh.
So it began to be very clear that a shift in knowledge of what the New Testament Greek was needed to happen. I say all that again to highlight the New Testament is written in Greek. And we have to translate that into any other language that we want to share these books in. But here's a second wrinkle, if I'm even counting correctly. Jesus in Judea and in the northern regions, like Galilee and those areas, Jesus spoke Aramaic.
I was going to ask.
Yeah. So when you get down to the backwater peasant world of Jesus, the people are speaking Aramaic. So it's like the language of certain sections of the Old Testament. And part of the reason there is it's very clear that the Jews have, by and large, lost Hebrew as their prime dialect, their prime language,
right?
And instead they've developed an acceptance and use of the dominant language among their people. So what we call the lingua franca, the language of the common man, was Aramaic for them.
Okay. And
they're on the far east of the empire, and Jesus most clearly is speaking in Aramaic when he's teaching. He is doing that, but when the gospel writers are sharing the teaching of Jesus, they're translating his Aramaic teaching into Greek, because guess what? Everyone else doesn't speak Aramaic,
right?
And you need people to read it. And Greek was the most common dialect in that world, because here's another wrinkle to the first century. If you were looking at a Mediterranean map and you drew a line, top down, you should draw it right on the western edge of Asia Minor. That line, generally speaking, helps you appreciate the empire being split west and east.
Okay.
All right. So Jerusalem represents the east, Rome represents the west. And the further east you went, the more Greek and the more local dialects were popular.
Okay.
The further west you went, Latin becomes the dominant language. Okay. And that will be significant for later church history. But again, our point here is the Bible is a translation of ancient documents written in Hebrew and portions of Aramaic for the Old Testament, and then Greek in the New Testament. That being said, we need a translation.
Right.
And a translation is what all of us have ever had in the English-speaking world. And that can be a little unsettling because we're used to saying this is the Word of God. This is the Bible. This is God's Word. We don't have to change saying that.
Right.
But we need to appreciate that these are translations, and that is the springboard to go and understand. So why are there so many Bibles, and why are they different, and how do I choose among them? So that's why when we talk about translations, I jump right into languages or Bibles, I jump into to languages because we have to talk about translations,
right?
Or versions, and those are not entirely synonymous, but they overlap in many important ways. And for this, there's no necessary reason to really kind of cut through all that, fine-tuned wise. So if I'm sitting at a bookstore and you and I were like, hey, let's go look at Bibles, I'm like, cool, let's go. And you say, what about this Bible? What about that Bible? I'm like, well, first, what kind of Bible are you looking for? And that might, again, be a really weird question, because there are Bibles that are translated for people who might have a different level of vocabulary.
Okay.
So, for example, the King James Version, they have scales. All major publishing houses have scales of vocabulary usage, grammar, and all that. It might say something like a King James Bible, right? 1611. That's a while ago.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know that you'll find anyone with, class of 1611. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, that would be regarded as an English Bible written at perhaps a high school level.
Okay.
But what if you have a problem like my friend that, he says, I have a 4th grade reading level.
That's going to be hard.
That's going to be hard. So that's why I'm asking, what kind of Bible do you want? Something that's easy to read, or are you interested in just reading some of the more common translations out there used with a higher level of vocabulary usage? And then there's, of course, who are you buying it for, yourself or a child? And they have Bibles for children,
right,
written at different lower grade levels. So again, what kind of Bible are we looking for? The most important, I guess, question out of that is, are you looking for something that's going to help you read through the text quickly, or are you trying to study the text of Scripture and you want a stronger sense of maybe the way the language appears in the original, like, manuscripts? And that's a big question, and I'll tell you why. Because those two questions represent two basic philosophies about Bible translation. The first one is, and both of these come with sort of pros and cons.
Mhm.
But the first one is what you might call the literal word for word Bible translation.
Right.
And there's a range even within that definition, which essentially is a translation into English that seeks to duplicate or represent the grammar and syntax, and even as strongly as possible, a almost one word to word correspondence.
Yeah.
So if the Greek text had 5 words, we're going to try to keep it to 5 words, right? And that sort of thing. And that can make a translation to be very rigid.
Yes.
And there are, like I said, extremes in the literal word for word philosophy, sometimes called formal equivalence.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the translations sometimes found online that boast to be literal translations are things like Young's literal translation, which is pretty much a little bit better polished interlinear. For those who don't know what an interlinear is, there are Bibles that you can get, of the New Testament in particular, those are far easier to get, that have the Greek text and underneath it a word for word translation. It ends up sounding like Yoda reading the Bible. That's essentially what it means.
Yeah.
That sounds like, right?
Right.
So, to the well we shall go. You know what I mean? Like, that does not represent normal English, right?
Right.
But if you're looking for that, Young's literal translation could do that for you. And some people like that. They feel that they're going to the source, which, okay, that's what you want. You have that there. Public domain, and knock yourself out. But if you're trying to read a Bible and you want to understand it in a more natural English, then you're going to need a translation. And for the most part, a formal equivalent or word for word is going to give you the best they can to be as literal as possible. And so that might be something you might be interested. On the other hand, the other far extreme is what is called the thought for thought or idiom, or the more technical word is dynamic equivalent. And sort of the idea there is we're trying to produce a translation that kind of duplicates the thought in the original,
Okay.
to people reading it in the receiver language, like English. So the language itself, the goal is not to duplicate the word order, the word structure, or anything like that necessarily. You have to do that to an extent. I'll get to that in a second. But the goal is, how do we reproduce this in an idiom that you can understand today? Basically, how would you say that today?
Mm-hmm.
And that can sometimes come with problems, just as a word for word translation can come with problems of rigidness,
Right.
and creating a artificial English. F.C. Grant in his book Translated the Bible, I think it was like an old book, but it's like came out in 1967 or something like that. It was a book about honoring the King James Version's history. That's why it came out. But he wrote this book. One of the things he says is a translation that came out that was probably superior to the King James was the American Standard Version of 1901. But he said the problem, even though it was superior in terms of what manuscripts they had, he said it failed to reach the heights of the King James because it was too rigid.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't written, it wasn't translated to the person who was going to read it.
Right.
It was rigid, and it sort of continued this artificial English.
Yeah.
Whereas the King James was known for its charm and beauty, its Shakespearean, the Elizabethan era artistry. Yes, and that sort of stuff. But so you have that extreme problem with the word for word, but with a thought for thought or dynamic translation, you have the problem of interpretation. Now, let me step back there. All translation has a level of interpretation.
Okay.
It's impossible to say, I'm going to take what you just said in English and translate it into Spanish and give it like, this is the only way you can say it.
Mm-hmm.
I might have another friend of mine sit here and go, well, you did reproduce what Tim said, but I could say it differently and still say the same thing.
Yeah.
So this is an interpretation of word choice, right? To get what you just said. And the same is true with all translations. There's an element of interpretation, sort of decisions.
Okay.
Right? But the problem with an idiomatic translation is that it leans heavily in these decisions of more interpretation, and you can creep in subtle theology that may not be there in the text.
Okay, yeah.
And that is why a lot of people who prefer more word-for-word translations like the New American Standard Bible or the New King James or the English Standard Version, or a Bible like the Christian Standard Bible that claims to be sort of in the middle, people prefer those because we're reducing translators' interpretations to a minimum.
Right.
Okay. So there's that issue. And there's some really outlandish versions out there that don't exactly do justice to the text. So setting these two out, dynamic and formal, and there's some that claim to be optimal, like the Christian Standard Bible. The thing about that is they claim to be in the middle. They claim we're a little bit of this and we're a little bit of that. I'm a little bit of country, a little bit of rock and roll, right? Like, but the problem there is every translation is.
Yeah.
So they're not exactly reinventing the wheel here. Every Bible, this is key for everyone. Every Bible is a mixture of formal equivalents, word for word,
Mm-hmm.
and dynamic or thought for thought because of the nature of the work of translation. I cannot translate properly without grounding my translation on representing what you're saying and how you said it.
Right. That makes sense.
But there might be times when your idiom in English doesn't work in the Spanish language, for example.
Right.
So I have to I might first say what you said and then go, but this is what he means. And I might have to use a different idiom to get my point across.
That makes sense.
So every translation has to do that at some level.
Mm-hmm.
So now we've approached translation philosophy. Who are we searching? Who are we looking for? We're looking for you. And so the real question after that then is, what Bible fits those categories for me? Especially if you're not a linguist, right? If you're not someone who's studied languages, I've spent probably a good, 7-8 years studying Greek and doing work on my own, graduate school, and all those other things. Hebrew, I'm admittedly a very beginner, but even in that situation, we're all sort of relying on these scholars that came together to translate these texts so we can read them. Here's a couple quick tips that can help you for the non-expert and for the average person. Open the first page in the Bible that you're going to read and read the introduction. Every Bible,
Mm-hmm.
I have my English Standard Version here. Every Bible has a preface, and they will tell you their commitment to the Bible. They will tell you their commitment to the legacy of the English Bible. They will tell you whether they're translating out of the Hebrew and the Greek and the Aramaic. They will tell you if this is a translation, if this is a Roman Catholic Bible. They will tell you if they're translating out of the Latin text, the Vulgate. If this is a Greek Orthodox translation, they will tell you what Greek text of the Old Testament they're translating from. They will give you all the information in the preface.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really surprising. It's really eye-opening when I've showed people this. I'm like, look, it's right. They're telling you what text they've had, what text they're using, what editions of these texts they're using. They're even telling you what philosophy of translation they're using. For example, the ESV here says the ESV is an essentially literal translation that seeks as far as possible to capture the precise wording of the original text and the personal style of each Bible writer. That's just the first sentence of the paragraph. But with that, they tell you, this is them showing you their cards.
Mm-hmm.
So every Bible has an introduction that kind of tells you and reveals their cards to you. And they will tell you, again, what critical editions of the Old Testament they're using. And some translations will use newer critical editions. And what I mean by that is, maybe I should explain that. So Bible scholars don't just take one ancient manuscript. Well, maybe the Old Testament is an exception here, because they have to have I'm trying to remember the word, but in the Old Testament they have to use they tend to use one major manuscript from what's called the Leningrad kind of codex family, and they use that sort of as the basis of their text, and they bring in a lot of other manuscripts to help improve it or better understand why certain things are missing, or why we've maybe translated something differently. And those are updated frequently. So newer translation might be, we want to represent the most recent critical editions of the Hebrew Old Testament, or the most recent work done in the New Testament. And people might go, okay, great. How does this affect me? I have a great illustration that recently happened to me. So I was teaching on the Ark. I mean, I wasn't on the Ark. I was teaching regarding the Ark. And one of the things that happened was I was reading from Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, where it says, when the Most High, from the English Standard Version, it said, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. What's interesting is, I had someone in the audience say, my Bible doesn't say that.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew I was immediately in trouble.
Yeah.
Or theoretically. But what theirs said was the sons of Israel.
Yours says sons.
Mine says sons of God.
Oh, sons of God. Okay.
So, which is true. Now, in the ESV, there's a footnote. It says, compare Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament. And then it says the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text, says sons of Israel. So I was asked why those two translations have two different phrases there.
Right.
Because sons of God is not the same as sons of Israel. Very different words. I believe it'd be something like Ha B'nai Elohim would be sons of God. And then I'm imagining it'd be something like B'nai, Israel or something like that, right? But the thing is, the footnotes tell you everything you need to see. The choice there are different manuscripts that support different, we call readings.
Okay.
And in 1611, when the King James translation was put out, they essentially only had what is called the Masoretic text, which is fine. It's a great text. It's important. But 400 years later, approximately, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which bring us to a text that's almost 700 to 800 years earlier, helps us see what the text looked like in the 2nd or 3rd century BC.
Right.
Where that text has sons of God. So, and then you have the Greek translation of the Hebrew text that's also dated around that period of time, also including sons of God. The reading then becomes a question of which is stronger, which has more strength to it, and that's why the ESV translators went that way.
Okay.
And here's the point, the thing here. All of our translations have a lot of this work going in it. And that's why at times our translations might read a little different. The King James, for example, which is considered to be the gold standard, right? It is the gold standard. It is the Bible my mama listened to growing up. It is the one my of course, your mama and your grandma and your great granddaddy read the King James. Guess what? Because it was the only Bible.
Right.
So in English, so to speak, that became the common Bible of everyone. But when you remember the first principle, the Bible is not an English book.
Right.
It is a translation of ancient documents from the ancient past that we have had to preserve and translate. This tends to happen when we find out, there was an older reading that's more likely to be accurate. We're going to follow that. So when you're selecting a Bible, do you want a Bible that is based on texts closer to the original time they were written? Written for what purpose? Are you going to be doing deep study, or are you going to be just for reading and leisure reading? Like, I just want to get through this book, right? Is this for like a different age group? And those sorts of questions. And if you can answer those questions by looking at the introduction or the preface, the final question you're going to have to answer for yourself is this going to be my main Bible? Or is this going to be one of several translations I will consult as I'm reading the Bible in English?
This would be, I would think, a good reason to look at parallels.
Yeah. Parallel Bibles are really great. I
mean, they make them where there's 2, there's 4.
Yeah. There are sometimes, and sometimes they can be really, really thick, and they tend to only do for the New Testament. I don't know that I've ever seen an Old Testament parallel Bible, but there are excellent formats that are out there for, you can have 4 different translations of the same text in the same opening in a book, and really get a sense like sometimes a word choice
Yeah.
does everything. All of a sudden you go, oh, okay. There's this passage in, I want to say 2 Corinthians, where the Apostle Paul tells the Corinthians, let's see here. Oh boy, I should. Let's see. We'll have to not pause this,
Yeah.
but we'll have to edit that, but we'll find it. Let me just, before we'll end it with this. Next one. First Corinthians. All right. So, wherever we get to, so there's this really interesting passage in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13. The English Standard Version has, "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong."
Okay.
Now, that reads pretty smoothly.
Yeah.
But if you were to read it in the King James Version, you get something like, "Quit ye like men." Yeah, I saw your eyes glaze back a little bit. That just highlights, for example, the need for a Bible in your own language, in your own version, or your own era of English. Right? Like, we're all languages change, all languages mutate, all languages develop different idioms over time, and different words have given different weight or have different meanings. I remember going to my father-in-law's house. Now, I grew up in San Francisco, and I remember going to my father-in-law's house, and he had a little library in his living room, and I was just like, books, amazing. And I started like scouring through the book titles, and one of them was How to Have Gay Parties. Coming from San Francisco, born and raised San Francisco, like, I thought, what is going on in my father-in-law's bookshelves?
Right.
But if you recall, when the Flintstones came out,
A gay old time.
You had a gay old time. The word gay
was happy,
fun, joyful, gleeful, right? So we'll have a gay old time. Well, my father-in-law was having gay parties, Yeah. And but we know that today that has a very different meaning. It's associated with sexual orientation.
Right.
It's associated with a community.
Right.
So we know that language evolves even within our own lifetime.
What was the Jesus' first miracle?
The wedding feast of Cana.
When is
John chapter 2?
When how does he refer to his mom?
Oh yeah. So in John chapter 2, when Mary says the wine has failed, right, which the wine didn't fail anything. There's no more wine. Right. It didn't pass it. It didn't fail a test. But Jesus responds to her. A literal translation would say, "Woman, what does it have to do with me?"
Right.
Ironically, however, in the Greek text, it literally says, "Woman, what to you, what to me?" Which
I love that.
Is clearly an idiom of, where do I fit in all this?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what business is this of ours?
Right.
It's clearly an idiom suggesting that. But the issue that I think you're bringing up is woman.
Yeah.
So
if I refer to my mom that way?
Yeah. Woman, Especially with that accent, especially with that kind of tone. The thing is, in Jesus' time, the word woman could refer to words in the ancient world did sometimes more than single duty. They had double duty. They might have multiple meanings. And the word for woman is one of them. So it could refer to, he didn't say mother per se. There's a word mater, but he said woman, which can mean wife. Clearly, that's not the view in mind. It can refer to like a woman walking down the street, a descriptive of a gender. But it can also refer to, especially in direct address, as madam. Ma'am.
Okay.
We might say kind of like a respectful response to mother, right? It's not mom, but it's might be like a sense of respectfully mom or ma'am or something, yes ma'am, yes'm, right?
Exactly.
And so that culturally and understanding the language softens our modern reading of saying woman. Why did Jesus talk to her like that, right? But he's probably most likely speaking ma'am, mom, like mom, in a respectful way. What exactly does that have to do with us, right? Like, why are you looking at me like that, mom?
Yep.
And reading the subtext, he knew.
Yeah.
I want you to fix this.
Right.
Be gracious to it seems to be a poor couple getting married, and provide the wine.
Son, do something.
Do something, right? So that again goes back to the knowledge of a translation, knowing that there are these little things that happen, and this all leads to the final thing. You don't have to be married to a translation. Some of us get married to a translation.
Yeah.
This is the Bible I'm only going to use. This is the Bible I memorized. This is and that's okay. You can do that if you want. But the problem there is confusing that wording as the only way the wording of Scripture can be translated in. And you sort of built this like loyalty to one translation.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, every translation has problems. And if anything is like a marriage, you're going to have to just learn to accept the problems and limits of your Bible.
Yeah.
Just like you accept the limits and difficulties of the other person. So that's what I would do. The short point is this: bullet points. Do you want a Bible that is based on texts closest to the original? A Bible that is for study or for reading, easy reading? Do you want a Bible perhaps with footnotes? Do you want a Bible that will help you compare it with other translations?
Right.
So I think at the end of the day, I don't technically try to recommend any particular Bible. I like using the English Standard Version. It's my preaching text, but I use all the other ones,
Yeah.
So
great. Well, thank you so much, Jovan. I appreciate that. And hopefully that answers the question. And if you, in listening tonight or today, if you've come up with a question you'd like to put forth to possibly be answered, feel free to go over to our website at monkeybreadtheology.com and click on that submit a question link and fill it out, send it to us, and maybe that'll be one that's coming up. So again, thank you for joining us. Hopefully you've learned something or have something that you can take away from this.
Yeah, really appreciate you joining us. I just want to encourage all of you to keep pursuing your questions, finding answers to your questions. Some things are a matter of exploration and journey, and this could be one of them for you. So if you have any follow-up questions to our episode today, please submit a question. We'll see you next time.